The sky was so clear that it almost looked fake, a perfect, uninterrupted stretch of blue hanging over the dusty road that led up to my ranch. Late afternoon sunlight bathed everything in gold, glinting off the barbed wire fence and casting long shadows across the porch where I stood, boots scuffing against the worn wooden planks. It was the kind of quiet, peaceful moment that made ranch life worth all the hard work. And then, like a snake slithering through the grass, that peace was shattered. I saw her before she saw me. A woman in pressed khaki pants and a pastel blouse, a clipboard clutched in her arms like it was a badge of authority. Her hair was stiff with hairspray, not a single strand daring to move despite the Kansas wind. I knew exactly who she was before she even reached the porch. Maggie Wilcott. Newly elected chairperson of the North Prairie Estates Homeowners Association. Or, as some folks had started calling her behind her back, the HOA Karen. I'd owned my ranch for over 30 years. Built by my father long before the neat little rows of cookie-cutter houses started sprouting up on the far side of the ridge. Technically, the front acreage of my property fell within the boundaries of North Prairie Estates, but I had never paid much attention to the HOA or their rules. Fence heights, mailbox colors, the length of grass in a front yard, none of that had anything to do with ranch life. My place had history, grit, and purpose. It wasn't some suburban lawn display. But Maggie was here for a reason. She strode toward my porch with the kind of posture that said she wasn't here for a friendly chat. Her eyes scanned my property like a vulture sizing up a dying animal. The horse corral. The barn, weathered but sturdy. The large, round hay bales stacked neatly along the fence line. I could already see the disapproval tightening her lips, the way her nose wrinkled at the faint, earthy scent of livestock. She stopped just short of the steps and looked at her clipboard. "Mr. Callahan?" Her voice was clipped, professional, but laced with that tone I knew all too well, the kind bureaucrats use when they think they've already won. "That's me," I said, offering her a slight tip of my hat. "Something I can help you with?" She sniffed, clearly unimpressed with my lack of urgency. "I'm here on behalf of the North Prairie Estates HOA. We've received multiple complaints." I didn't say anything, just watched her. She let the silence linger for dramatic effect before continuing. "There have been concerns regarding the livestock, the odor, and," she gave a meaningful glance toward the equipment near the barn, "unsightly structures visible from the public road." I exhaled slowly, biting back a sharp reply. This was farmland. The smell of livestock was part of the deal. This barn and these fields had been here longer than the HOA, longer than the houses creeping closer with every passing year. "That's so," I said, keeping my voice even. Maggie pursed her lips. "Yes. The HOA is expanding its enforcement zone to ensure a consistent aesthetic throughout North Prairie Estates. It's all in the CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I assume you've read them?" I almost laughed. My father built this ranch before there was even a development across the ridge. I don't recall ever signing off on HOA jurisdiction. She smirked, as if she'd been waiting for that exact response. "Oh, I brought copies." She handed me a thick stack of papers, filled with highlighted sections on livestock, yard maintenance, and community standards. I flipped through the pages, seeing absurd regulations about mailbox heights, acceptable shrubbery, and approved exterior paint colors. Then, buried in vague language, a clause about non-standard domestic animals requiring HOA approval. I lowered the stack, my voice flat. "My ranch predates your development. I think we need to sort this out with a lawyer if you're serious about applying these rules to me." Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "We have plenty of resources, Mr. Callahan. The question is whether you prefer to work with us amicably, or if we'll need to escalate." There it was. The threat, wrapped in polite words but carrying the weight of full-blown legal warfare. I tipped my hat again. Amicably would be best, I said, voice calm. Provided that means leaving my ranch alone. She sniffed, turned on her heel, and walked briskly back toward her car. As I watched her go, a slow, sinking dread settled in my gut. I'd dealt with bureaucrats before, but Maggie Wilcott had the righteous zeal of a woman who thought she could bend the land to her will. Little did I know, this was just the opening shot. The first letter arrived the next morning, tucked neatly into my mailbox like a snake wading in the grass. At first glance, it looked like some generic notice from the HOA, the kind most folks ignored without a second thought. But as soon as I unfolded the crisp sheet of paper and saw the bold, capitalized violation notice staring back at me, my blood ran hot. Notice of infraction. Failure to adhere to North Prairie Estates community standards regarding unsightly structures and non-standard livestock. Immediate corrective action required. Failure to comply will result in fines, legal action, or property liens. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady the frustration curling inside me. This was no misunderstanding. This was war. By the end of the week, the letters started arriving daily. Each one had a new complaint, a new regulation I was supposedly violating. One claimed that the manure pile near my barn was an environmental hazard. Another insisted that my tractor was an eyesore and needed to be stored in an enclosed structure. A particularly laughable one demanded that I repaint my barn to match the neutral earth tone palette of the neighborhood. I tossed that one straight into the fire. I tried calling the HOA office, but the cheery receptionist on the other end played dumb. "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to email the board for formal disputes." When I did, my emails bounced back unanswered. When I drove down to their office in town, I found a locked door and a sign stating that visits were by appointment only. They had built a wall of bureaucracy around themselves, a fortress of red tape meant to wear people down. I wasn't about to roll over. But as the days passed, I realized Maggie had more than just letters up her sleeve. One afternoon, my old friend Hank Lawson pulled into my driveway, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust as he rolled to a stop. He climbed out, his face drawn with worry, and held up a folded piece of paper. "Heard from my nephew," he said grimly. "Works part-time for the county inspector's office. Figured you ought to see this." I took the paper and skimmed it. My barn was being flagged for a structural integrity review, something that only happened if a formal complaint was filed. "They're claiming it's unstable," Hank muttered. I huffed a dry laugh. That barn's withstood tornadoes, hailstorms, and 2 feet of snow on the roof. "What's their argument?" Hank shrugged. "Don't need an argument when you got enough complaints to force an inspection." Sure enough, 2 days later, a county inspector showed up. A younger guy, probably fresh on the job, with a clipboard and a tired expression. He walked through the barn, inspecting beams and framework, tapping at the wood like he expected it to crumble under his knuckles. When he finished, he let out a sigh and shook his head. "More than up to code," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Waste of my damn time, if you ask me." I watched him leave, but I knew it wasn't over. Maggie wasn't after fairness. She was after submission. And she wasn't done yet. A few nights later, just as I was settling in with a fresh cup of coffee, I noticed something outside. Headlights. Parked near the fence line at the edge of my property. The SUV sat idle, its engine humming in the still night air. I narrowed my eyes and grabbed my flashlight before stepping out onto the porch. The second I flicked the beam in their direction, the window rolled down. There she was. Maggie Wilcott, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning my land like a scavenger looking for scraps. Seated beside her was a man I recognized, Greg Turner, the HOA treasurer, looking considerably less comfortable than she did. "Can I help you folks?" I called, my voice even but firm. Maggie offered me one of those fake, polished smiles. "Just conducting an inspection," she said, as if that made it any less ridiculous. I let the words hang in the air. Didn't see a notice about that. She shrugged, unfazed. We don't need your permission to view the property from a public road. It's in the HOA guidelines. I took a slow step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel. You can look all you want from out there, I said, voice low, but if you set foot past that fence without my permission, you'll be trespassing. For the first time, Greg shifted uncomfortably. He coughed into his fist and avoided my gaze, like he knew they were pushing too far. But Maggie didn't even blink. She simply tapped her clipboard against her knee and smirked. We'll be in touch. And with that, the SUV backed up and disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but a swirl of dust and a bad taste in my mouth. I clenched my jaw as I watched their taillights fade. They weren't going to stop. Not until I gave in. But they had another thing coming. If Maggie Wilcott thought she could drown me in paperwork and red tape, she was about to find out that some things, like land, history, and a man's will to fight, couldn't be buried so easily. The storm rolled in just after sunset, a thick wall of black clouds swallowing the last of the daylight. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching the sky churn. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that set animals on edge. My horses shifted uneasily in the corral, snorting and stamping as the wind picked up. A storm like this could do some damage, but I had prepared for worse. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the real disaster wasn't just coming from the sky. It had already been set in motion, thanks to Maggie Wilcott and her HOA. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight, when I was woken by a hard, rapid knocking at my door. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it open to find Deputy Tom Mercer, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his breath coming fast. "Callahan, we need your help," he said without preamble. "There's flooding over by the south end of North Prairie. Bad." That caught my attention. The land over there sloped downward, and any heavy rain would rush straight through the development. But they had storm drains for that, or so I thought. "What's wrong with the drainage system?" I asked, already pulling on my boots. "Blocked," Mercer muttered. "Completely backed up. Water's coming up fast. A couple homes are already taking on water." I frowned, throwing on my rain jacket. "Blocked how?" He hesitated. "Looks like years of built-up debris. No one's been maintaining the culverts. HOA's responsibility, I guess." I cursed under my breath. The same HOA that had spent months harassing me over barn paint and tractors had ignored the one thing that actually mattered, basic infrastructure. By the time we reached the southern edge of the subdivision, it was chaos. Water surged down the streets, swallowing curbs and creeping up front porches. A few desperate homeowners waded through knee-high water, dragging sandbags into place, but it was a losing battle. The main culvert, the only thing standing between these people and disaster, was clogged with a tangled mess of branches, trash, and, to my utter disbelief, a discarded lawn chair. "We need to clear it fast," Mercer shouted over the roar of rushing water. "Got your tractor?" I nodded and climbed into the cab. Rain hammered down, turning the ground into a thick soup of mud, but I maneuvered the machine toward the blockage. With heavy chains and a little brute force, I started pulling debris free. The moment the first mass of garbage broke loose, the water surged forward, disappearing into the drainage system where it should have gone in the first place. It took 2 hours of hard, backbreaking work, but by the time we finished, the worst of the flooding had been diverted. Homes that had been on the verge of being swallowed by water were spared. The neighborhood had been lucky, but only just. That's when I saw her. Maggie Wilcott. Standing under a neighbor's porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, rain flattening her perfectly styled hair. She was pale, shaken, but most of all, silent. I met her gaze across the flooded street. For the first time, there was no smirk, no clipboard, no smug condescension. Just wide, shell-shocked eyes. I waited for an apology. A word of thanks. Something. But she just turned and disappeared into the night, refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. I wasn't surprised. But the neighborhood sure was. By morning, the rumors were already spreading. The HOA had failed them. The very people who had harassed homeowners over mailbox colors and fine print regulations had neglected to do the one thing that actually mattered: keep the community safe. A group of homeowners gathered near the clubhouse that afternoon, whispering in hushed, angry voices. When I walked past, I caught snippets of their conversation. Knew something was off about those budget meetings. So they had time to fine people over lawn chairs, but not to clean the drains? If Callahan hadn't shown up, half these houses would have been ruined. The tide was turning, and Maggie could feel it. For the first time, she was losing control. I went about my day, repairing fence lines and checking on my livestock, but I could feel the shift in the air, not just from the storm, but from the people. They weren't afraid of Maggie anymore. And neither was I. The fallout from the flood was swift and merciless. By the next morning, the streets of North Prairie Estates were dry, but the damage had already been done, the real kind, the kind that spreads through whispered conversations and shared outrage. The neighborhood had barely been spared from disaster, and everyone knew exactly whose fault it was. The HOA had spent months nitpicking over flower beds and porch lights but had failed at the one responsibility that actually mattered: keeping the community safe. The residents weren't just annoyed anymore. They were furious. I didn't have to go looking for the consequences. They found me. It started with a knock at my door later that afternoon. When I pulled it open, I found Greg Turner, the HOA treasurer, standing there, looking like a man who just realized he was on a sinking ship. His usual stiff posture was gone, replaced by uneasy shifting and a nervous glance over his shoulder. "Callahan," he said, clearing his throat. "Can we talk?" I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Didn't think the HOA was big on friendly visits. He let out a heavy sigh. "I'm not here as the HOA," he admitted. "I'm here because, well, things are getting ugly." I said nothing, waiting. He shifted again before finally blurting it out. "I have proof. Of everything. The fines, the fake complaints, the bogus inspections, it was all Maggie. And that's not even the worst of it." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I recorded a meeting. A private one. She was bragging about using the sheriff's department to harass you. Said if she called enough times, they'd get fed up and handle the problem for her." My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice level. "Why are you telling me this now?" Greg exhaled sharply, glancing back toward his car. "Because the board is turning on her. The flood was the last straw. People are talking about a vote of no confidence. And once they hear what's on this recording," he trailed off, then met my gaze. "I just want out of this mess." I nodded once. "Then hand it over." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. I took it without a word, then watched as he hurried back to his car and drove off. That night, the recording leaked. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, a crowd gathered outside the HOA clubhouse, demanding answers. People who had once been afraid of Maggie's endless rules and fines were now loud, angry, and fed up. Some held printed transcripts of the leaked recording. Others clutched copies of their own ridiculous violation notices, waving them in the air like evidence in a trial. Maggie tried to do damage control, but for the first time, she wasn't in control anymore. "I've always had the community's best interests at heart," she declared, standing at the top of the clubhouse steps, her voice crisp and polished. "These accusations are..." A woman near the front of the crowd cut her off. "Did you or did you not call the sheriff's department and lie about Callahan?" Maggie's eyes flashed. "That's a gross mischaracterization of..." "Answer the question." Silence. The crowd exploded into shouting. Some called for her resignation. Others wanted a full audit of the HOA's finances. Then came the real bombshell. A local journalist, who had picked up the story after the flood, uncovered financial records showing that Maggie had been misusing HOA funds, not just for her personal landscaping, but for questionable legal expenses, inflated consultant fees, and private contractors paid for work that never happened. Within hours, 2 board members resigned. Within a day, the HOA called an emergency meeting to discuss removing Maggie from power. Within a week, she was done. I didn't bother showing up for the vote. I already knew how it would end. Maggie Wilcott had spent months trying to bring me down, but in the end, she had dug her own grave. And the best part? I never had to lift a finger to push her in. Maggie Wilcott didn't go quietly. Even after the HOA board officially voted her out, even after residents demanded an audit of her shady financial dealings, she refused to admit defeat. She stormed out of that final meeting with her chin held high, muttering about how the neighborhood would fall apart without her guidance. But the truth was, no one was listening anymore. Her power was gone, stripped away by the very people she had spent months terrorizing. The woman who once controlled the community with a clipboard and a phone call now had no authority, no allies, and, most importantly, no one left to intimidate. It didn't stop there. The district attorney's office started sniffing around the false 911 reports, and rumor had it that she was under investigation for misusing HOA funds. Even the sheriff's department, tired of being used as her personal enforcers, made it clear that another false emergency call would result in criminal charges. The woman who had weaponized bureaucracy and legal threats against me was now tangled up in the very system she had abused. Karma has a funny way of evening the score. As for me, my fight was already won. The newly elected HOA board reached out through their attorney, practically begging for a settlement. They offered everything I wanted: a full dismissal of all claims against my ranch, coverage of my legal fees, and a legally binding agreement that the HOA would never interfere with my land again. I signed the paperwork with a quiet sense of victory. Not the loud, gloating kind, the kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground and came out the other side stronger. A few weeks later, I stood at the edge of my property, watching the sun dip below the hills. The fields stretched out before me, untouched and untamed, just as they had been for generations. The cattle moved lazily, the barns stood tall, and beyond the ridge, the houses of North Prairie Estate still stood, but the fear and control that had once ruled that place were gone. The neighborhood had learned a lesson. Some things shouldn't be controlled. Some fights are worth standing your ground for. As for Maggie? Last I heard, she moved to another town. No doubt looking for another neighborhood to rule. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. HOA Karens like her never really disappear, they just move on to the next victim. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.